Hey guys, it's Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. Welcome back to the channel. It is a very big day. If you are new here, thank you for finding me. If you could please subscribe and give us a like and give us a comment, that would be a huge help. I say it every time. It is very much true though, so thank you so much for doing that. For everyone who has done it before and everyone who's going to do it in the future, why is it such a big day? Are you kidding me? It is the Eureka Millionaire Express release. This is the second, like, whatever you want to call it, gold ribbon, you know, elite tier, 5-star, lavish, deluxe treatment of a single Hong Kong film released this year. The other one being the Young Master release from 88 Films, which as you can see I have it behind me right here. This is an insane set. So if you get the one of the first 3,000, which is the limited first run, you get 2 discs. There are 4 versions of the movie. A lot of people would say that this is Sammo Hung's best film. I think it's this, Eastern Condors, and then James Oliver actually writes about this a little bit in his essay that's in the limited booklet here. And Pedicab Driver are really kind of the 3 that I think a lot of people will point to as their favorite Sammo Hung films. This and Eastern Condors really were, like, I think kind of the pinnacle of his career as a filmmaker, you could argue. Height of his popularity and just such incredible 80s Hong Kong films. This was a new Chinese New Year's release in 1986, so it came out January 30th of 1986. It was shot in 1985, and it's just a really fantastic, incredible film. I'm not going to talk too much about the movie itself because this is going to be a really long review anyway, because it would take you, I actually calculated this, 11 hours and 40 minutes just about to watch everything that is on here. It is insane. And so I really will only have time in this review to talk about the release itself, but if you're unfamiliar with the film, it's basically like everyone who is everyone in 80s Hong Kong cinema, with the exception of Jackie Chan. It's Sammo Hung, it's Yuen Biao, Yuen Hua's in it, Lam Ching Ying, Eric Tsang, Richard Ng, Richard Norton, Cynthia Rothrock, Yasuaki Kurata, Yukari Oshima, Rosamund Kwan, Emily Chu. God, who else is in this movie? The list, James Tien is in this film, Jimmy Wang Yu is in this film. I actually wrote down this huge list of everyone who's in it, but I mean, that covers, I think, a lot of the big names who are in here. Lau Kar-wing is in it, Chin Kar-lak. Like, it's just insane. In every single scene, you're like, I know that person, I know that person, I know that person, I know that person. And it's like one of those classic mid-80s Sammo Hung comedies with, like, the silliness and the homage to, like, silent films of Buster Keaton and stuff like that you'll see in, like, the Lucky Stars series, which Eureka also released this year, which I have right here. Mixed with just like some of the most amazing, insane, non-stop martial arts. Like the last maybe 20 or 30 minutes, whatever it is, like of this film is just non-stop insane fighting. And the stunts in here are insane. Like people literally jumping off of buildings. Like it is bananas. One of my favorite fights ever is in this, which is Dick Wei versus, Dick Wei's in it too, Yuen Biao. At the end, if you've seen the film, you'll be familiar with that fight. It's not super long, but it's so good. And Sammo versus Cynthia Rothrock is so good. And all the fighting with like Yasuaki Kurata and Yukari Oshima and Huang Zhongli, who's one of their, it's like 3 people together, those 3. And they're like using like ninja swords and samurai swords, and because they play like Japanese people who get involved in the movie. But it's a pretty simple plot. There's like a town it's kind of like out in the middle of nowhere in China. But it looks very much like an American Western, right? And a train breaks down, and there's a lot of plot machinations involved in why the train breaks down and stuff like that, but I'm not going to like go into all the details of the plot. But what you basically need to know is there's a ton of people who ended up getting stranded in this town, and then chaos ensues with like there's bank robbers, and there's ninjas, and there's bandits on horses, and like it's madness and chaos, and there's lots of amazing fighting and lots of ridiculous and silly humor, and it's just a great classic Sammo Hung film. So that's basically my 2 cents on the movie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the release. I'm going to talk about the picture quality of it, the physical aspects of the release, and then all the bonus features too. So rather than me just go on and on talking about how it looks, I'll just kind of show you here. So I did this as well with, if you saw my review of Wild Search, which Eureka put out last week. Which is, I think that came out July 19th of 2021. So here's a clip from an old DVD I have of Millionaire Express. And now here's that same scene from this recent Blu-ray release. So you can see the difference there for yourself. And one of the things that's really astounding about this new transfer and this remaster is that this film had a really big budget, and that's something that basically everyone talks about. Like Frank Jang talks about it in his commentary, James Oliver talks about it in his essay, Arna and Mike talk about it in their commentary track. Like, it was a big budget film, and it was like a big event film. And you can see how well that money was spent in this remaster, because you can see like the texture of the costumes. And it's funny because everyone says, you know, Cynthia Rothrock in her interviews, and like everyone who talks about the film talks about how they filmed this movie in the summer, but it took place in the winter. So they're wearing like wool coats, like period costumes, like, and you can see like the wool, and you can see like there's a scene in the beginning with these Russian military guys, and you can see like all the details of like their weapons are correct, and like everything is so accurate. And like when you go into the interiors, like the wallpaper, and you can see the texture of it and the beds and all this stuff, it's like really, really kind of incredible. And you can see all that like in the transfer. So that's basically that, and that's what it looks like. So let's talk about the physical aspects. There's 3,000 of the first run, as I said, and you get the slipcase with the 3,000, which is the slipcase right here, and the artwork is by Darren Wheeling. And then you get this awesome poster right here. I'm like juggling so many materials right now that I'm trying, because I have the press release here too, as you can see. Because I'm gonna read some stuff off the back of this to make my job a little bit easier in a minute when I'm telling you about the bonus material. But so this is the artwork there that you have on the slipcase on one side of this poster, and then on the other side of the poster you have this absolutely amazing thing here. So Shanghai Express is a title that was used for one of the English, there's a cut of this film that's called Shanghai Express that was made specifically for English-speaking audiences, and that's one of the cuts that's on this release, and so that's what that poster is for. And then you have a James Oliver essay here, and it's a really cool essay. It contextualizes the film within Sammo's career, and it analyzes the film a little bit. It talks about everybody who's in the film. It talks about why Jackie Chan is not in the film, which is something that everyone kind of discusses a little bit in their own way throughout the commentary tracks and interviews and stuff like that. And what makes this film so special, and why it's such an important film, like in the history. I mean, this is really one of those films where, like, if you're really serious about Hong Kong cinema and you love Hong Kong cinema and you really want to see like everything that's really like must-see movies, like for reference points and stuff like this, I think this is absolutely one of those films, you know. And not everyone is gonna I love this guy so much, Richard Ng. He's like one of the funniest people in the world. And this scene where he's running across the top of the train is just like so ridiculous. And so funny. It's like probably my favorite gag in that whole movie. And there's these amazing kind of photos at the end here. But I really think this is a must-see movie. And like I said, not everyone's going to like it, but it's like, you know, if you're serious about cinema, you see a Kubrick movie or two or three or four or five, and not everyone likes Kubrick, but you got to see it because you just have to know, you know. And I think this is kind of similar, not to compare this movie to Kubrick, but I think this movie is a lot more fun than any Kubrick movie I've ever seen. But you get my point, hopefully, that it's just something you got to see. It just is. So here's the discs. And then the artwork in the back of this thing is totally awesome. So I'm going to pop the discs out and gingerly place them over here so you can see what's going on the back of the... Yeah, that's really cool, right? I like that a lot. So, yeah, so then we'll get into the features that are on here, all the bonus material, and I will talk to you about that once I replace the discs in the case. So we have two commentary tracks like I said, there's 4 versions of the film. So let me just tell you about that real quick. You get the Hong Kong theatrical release of the film as it was released in 1986 with the Cantonese mono audio. And there are English dubs throughout as well for people who are interested in that. That cut is 97 minutes long, and there's a Frank Zhang commentary on that cut. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. There's the international cut, which is 102 minutes long. Now, that cut was made for kind of like broadly all international audiences. So it's really interesting to see, like, for instance, if you're familiar with this film, there's a group of characters who are prostitutes in this movie. And some of the material with the prostitutes is cut out of the international version, even though it's longer. And as Frank Zhang explains on his audio commentary, they're selling this movie to kind of some countries around Asia that are more conservative than Hong Kong, like, for instance, Indonesia, Malaysia, places like that, right? And so in those places, the stuff with the prostitutes, because they're very sympathetic characters, that's not going to fly in those places, right? So that material had to come out, and then other material was added in. So it's really interesting to hear. Like, I'm not going to go into the differences between all the cuts because there are ample resources online where you can go and look that up, but that's also discussed at length in this release. So just get the release and you can learn all about it. And then there's the Shanghai Express, which I said that was the version that was made specifically for English-speaking audiences. That's a 93-minute version. And then you have a hybrid cut. So that takes all the footage that's unique amongst all the versions and sticks them together. So that is like ostensibly an ultimate cut, like the most complete cut where everything is in there, right? And that's 109 minutes. So the Shanghai Express cut and the hybrid cut are on that second disc, which I believe is exclusive to the first 3,000. So if you want to see those versions, you really got to get on top of that. So for interviews, there are a ton of interviews on here, and there really are. So let me tell you about them. There are 3 Cynthia Rothrock interviews. One of them is brand new that was made for this release. That one is 16 minutes long. There are 2 archival interviews. So an archival interview, if you're unfamiliar, is one that has been released on another DVD or Blu-ray somewhere in the world, or was conducted years ago and was on TV or something like that, and was then, they got the license for it and they put it on this release. So the archival interviews with Cynthia Rothrock are 14 and 24 minutes. So there's about an hour worth of interviews with Cynthia Rothrock, and that's on top of a 17-minute long scene-specific commentary she does that's her and Frank Zhang talking about certain scenes within the film. I will talk about that in a minute when I talk about the commentaries. Cynthia's interviews are really, really fantastic. I've seen her in a bunch of movies, but I learned a ton about her career. Like, she talks about when she first started doing martial arts, why she first started doing martial arts, how Corey Yun saw her at a demonstration and ended up casting her. And she talks about being in Yes Madam and working with Michelle Yeoh, working with Dick Wei. Like, Dick Wei I think it's pronounced Dick Y, but I'm like so set in my ways. Dick Y on Yes Madam kicked her in the head. Because she talks about how, like, different people that you work with in these films, they hit you with different degrees of aggression. Like, Sammo is known for hitting really, really hard, for instance, but she said she was ready for that because everyone talks about that. So when she did her fight with Sammo, she's like, okay, he's going to hit me really hard. I'm ready for it. But she said with Dick Y, she was, like, totally unprepared, and he kicked her in the head, like, full on in Yes Madam, and it split her ear tube open on the inside of her ear. Like, he kicked her that's insane. He kicked her so hard, the inside of her head, something split open. So anyway, that's Dick Y for you. If you don't know, he was actually like a martial artist. He wasn't a movie guy, and he was recruited, I think, by Sammo, who saw him doing a demonstration in, I think, Taiwan at a martial arts school. But it's just, you learn so much about Cynthia and her whole career, how she got cast on these films, what it was like being on set. She got a free picture deal with Golden Harvest after she was in Yes Madam, and what it was like working with Sammo. And she said that Sammo is probably the best director she's ever worked with, and what he's like on set. And Kenny B is in this film. Kenny B is awesome, and I love Kenny B. I've just been discovering Kenny B's like early 80s like Hong Kong sex comedies, and he's like, I love him in those movies. And he plays a character in this movie that, according to a lot of people, Jackie Chan was actually supposed to play. But he's great in this movie. And she talks about how Kenny B spoke really good English. And so Kenny B, her, and Richard Norton would basically just hang out all the time and just talk nonstop in English because everyone else was talking in, there were people talking in Japanese on the movie. There were people talking in Cantonese on the movie, and like all these different languages going on. So her and Richard Norton and Kenny B like formed their little English language group. And then Raymond Chow's daughter was the other person who spoke great English and would like hang out with her a lot and help translate for her and stuff like that. But she really just goes over her whole career, and it's really fantastic. So there are 2 Sammo interviews here. One is 11 minutes and one is 15 minutes. So you get 26 minutes of Sammo interviews, and he talks about like working with his screenwriting partner who he had worked with a lot before, and like how they kind of conceived of this movie and how he loves John Wayne. And I should also say that James Oliver does some really interesting in his essay comparisons to other like he talks about how there are parts in this film that are similar to Sergio Corbucci films, who was making spaghetti westerns, and like a lot. I'm not terribly familiar with the world of spaghetti westerns, and I really only know the Sergio Leone, like Clint Eastwood film. So it was really interesting to read about that in that essay. That's like a big blind spot for me in my love of movies, is those spaghetti westerns. So, but Sammo talks about like his love of westerns and why he wanted to make a western, but also how he wanted to make a film that at its core was very much Chinese film. And he talks about Shanghai, and how people in Shanghai used to dress in kind of a Western style, and it had this kind of like, like Wild West vibe to it, even though obviously it's in the East. And he was kind of inspired by that in making this film. And he talks about fighting style and how, like, during the writing process, one of the things that he was doing was trying to come up with fighting styles for each of the characters and thinking who he would cast as each of the characters and how he would kind of put the film together and stuff like that. So there's just great interviews. And I mean, obviously, the guy made the movie. The guy is the star of the movie. He co-wrote the movie. Like, you learn so much hearing him talk about the film. So then Yoon Bi-yoo has an interview that's 21 minutes long, and that's a really great interview, and that's an archival interview as well as our Sammo's. And Yoon Bi-yoo talks a lot about like what it was like being on set and how like everyone was like everyone he knew basically except for Jackie, right, was there, and they were all hanging out, and he was like, at one point he said that he was like looking around and like with the crew and the cast and like all the people working on that movie, there were like hundreds of people there, and he's like, is it like is this like silly, really fun movie that we're doing that's this amazing experience with friends just hanging out? Like, does it justify there being this many people here and us spending this much money on it? But just like a great ambiance on set, and everyone was so close with everyone else, and they loved each other so much. And he talks about how everyone would show up for Sammo. Like, everyone respected Sammo. And when Sammo was like, I'm doing a big movie, it's going to be a Chinese New Year's release, it's a huge cast. Like, Eric Chang is in this movie, who's like, as Arna and Mike say, he is an entire film industry into himself. He writes stuff, he produces stuff, he stars in stuff, he does television. He has done like category 3 films, like super dark, violent movies, and he's done comedies, and he's like a huge star. And he's in this movie in a relatively small part. And like, you see that in a lot of the, like, Yasuaki Kuratsu is a very big actor, and he's in like a relatively small role in this film. And all of that was because everyone loved and respected Sammo, and they showed up, and they didn't worry about how much they were getting paid, and they just wanted to work with him. And that's what Yoon Bi-yoo says in his interview. He also says that the screenwriter of this film had previously worked on a number of films with Richard Ng and Sammo Hung, and so they had like a really good rapport, and that Richard would work a lot with the screenwriter and come up with like different things about his character, and they would come up with comedy routines, and like they were firing ideas off of one another and stuff, and they had like a really great relationship. So that's the Yoon Bi-yoo interview, 21 minutes. Like I said, he talks a lot about like, in this scene, everyone talks about how like Sammo was the director, but everyone was involved. Like Cynthia Rothrock even, it was actually Yukari Oshima. She has a 30-minute interview. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Yukari Oshima talks about how like the camera crew and the guys who were doing the lights were like, you should do that kick a little bit higher. Like, can we do another take? Like, everyone would give their input, and Sam will listen to everyone. And, and so Yoon Bi-yoo talks about that, and how like, there's a scene where he does this crazy stunt, this jump off of the building, and how it was his idea for him to finish the jump and then walk into the scene and give a line with no break in that, with no cut, so that everyone knew it was him. There would be no second guessing about whether that was someone doubling for him. So that's really cool. And then the Yukari Oshima interview, 30 minutes long. This interview was fascinating. She talks about how she started doing martial arts, she started doing karate, why she started doing it. When she was 18 years old, she went to Tokyo to become a gym teacher. And she saw Young Master, and she's like, nope, I want to be in Hong Kong movies. And so she did everything she could to meet people in Japan who had connections to the Hong Kong film industry. She did auditions in hotel lobbies. Like, producers would come and visit Japan, and she'd like find out where they were staying and like do her martial arts routine for them, like in the hotel lobby. And like, Yasuaki Kuratsu was actually her teacher's teacher. So there was like a direct lineage there. So when she met him on this film, she said he was like her senpai kohai, like he was like her kind of like her mentor and like helped her a lot in the film and stuff like that. And she talks about how Sammo, like I said, other people have said, was very collaborative. And they were using Japanese swords, and so whenever there was a scene with the Japanese swords, he would go to Yukari Oshima and Yasuaki Kuratsu and be like, how would you be, like while they were choreographing the fights, be like, how would you use this sword? Like, what movements would you use? And what, because they're Japanese and they know Japanese martial arts, and Sammo's not as familiar with them, and how he would always defer to other people's expertise. But her interview is just fantastic, and she's so enthusiastic about the film and about her career. And that's something I noticed with Cynthia Rothrock too. They're both so happy that they got to be in these movies, and that they were, Cynthia Rothrock talks about how she was treated really well. Like, they gave her a Cantonese name and everyone was really friendly with her, and they would call her like madam, and like, but she never felt like an outsider. And like Sammo in his interview talks about how he doesn't feel that language is really that big of a deal. It's not that big of an impediment. Like, if you could do martial arts and you respect the filmmaking culture, if you understand the filmmaking techniques, if you could get on board with making the film, it doesn't matter who you are and where you're from, you belong there and that you will be accepted. And that's something that everyone kind of talks about. And it seems like this really amazing environment and this really strong sense of community and camaraderie across all these international borders of all these actors who were in the film, the performers. So those are the interviews. So now we have the commentary tracks. There's a 17-minute long scene-specific commentary with Cynthia Rothrock. And so basically she goes through a handful of scenes in the film with Frank Zhang actually asking her questions. It's really cool. It's almost like an interview. And she just talks about her experience in those scenes, what it was like being in the film, being on the set and stuff like that. It's really cool. So Frank's commentary. Frank does the commentary on the 97-minute long Hong Kong International Cut. And one of the things I wrote down to myself during Frank's commentary was, it's like having a human encyclopedia sitting next to you. Like, he just knows everything. And if you saw my interview with Frank, he does tons and tons of research for these tracks. So it should not be, we should not undervalue how much he cares about these commentary tracks. He does so much research, and he reads all these interviews, and he watches interviews, and a lot of the interviews are in Cantonese or Mandarin or in written Chinese language stuff that people like I would never have access to, that Frank is able to find and give us access to. And he knows so much, and he talks you through everyone's career. Everyone, there's the scene I talked about where Yoon Bu jumps off of the building, and this is a scene that Frank really loves, and he found an interview with Yoon Bu about that scene, and he talks about what Yoon Bu was saying about how they filmed that scene. And it's just really incredible information. There's a whole thing in this film where Jimmy Wang Yu plays Wong Fei Hung, and Frank talks about that whole section and how Quan Ta King was supposed to be in that section and why he isn't. And he talks about fighting styles in that section of the film and how they're references to different movies and like stuff I never would have known. He talks about Canada. The opening scene of this film takes place in Russia, but it's filmed in Canada. Frank talks about Canada and the connections between Hong Kong and Canada, especially in like the 1980s and stuff, and big waves of immigration and stuff like that. I'm just looking at my notes here to make sure I get all the cool stuff down. And he talks about Kenny B and Kenny B's career, and I learned a lot about. I knew who Kenny B was before this, but I didn't know that much about his career and his life, and so I learned a lot about him, and that was fascinating. I'm just trying to read my handwriting here. But, and the other thing that he talks about that I thought was really fascinating is he talks about how because this was a Chinese New Year's release, it had to appeal to everyone because families would go and see these films together. And he talks about how that informs the style of the film and what the film is about and how Sammo made the film. And his analysis of that is really, really fascinating. And it's not something that I really would have thought of or known that much about. So super cool information there. He talks a lot about Thailand. Actually, parts of this movie were shot in Thailand in summer. So if you know anything about Thailand in the summer, it's hot as balls. And so Frank talks a lot about how, like, he points out all these details about the scenes that were shot in Thailand and all of these like little things that I never would have noticed about how that would, given how hot it was in Thailand, what it would have been like shooting that scene, how they may have changed certain details of the film because of the heat, like stuff like that. It's really, really interesting. So that's Frank's commentary. And then we have Mike and Arna. I love Mike and Arna. They have so much camaraderie, and they're so silly together that it's a joy to listen to their commentaries because it's like laughing along with friends of yours and it's just like chatting and shooting the shit. And they're hilarious. There's a part in this commentary track where I was laughing so hard I was crying. There's a woman in this film who is rather large, and there's a scene where the building is on fire and she has to jump out of the building. So if you know what I'm talking about, you know that scene and you know that woman. Arna went on IMDb and looked up. See, I'm laughing just thinking about it. He looked up her credits and he reads her credits, and I was laughing so hard I was crying. And literally, all he's doing is reading this woman's credits and like the character she's played in the film she's been in. And I had to pause it because I was missing what they were saying because I was laughing so hard. One of the things that I found really fascinating actually about this commentary track is they talk about how Sammo was almost 2 times involved in Star Wars. In the Star Wars universe, I should say. And I had no idea. And so I learned a lot about that, and that was really cool. Mike talks about that. They talk about Bolo Young, because Bolo Young is actually in this film, too, in a really, really brief. He's basically, it's like a couple shots. And they talk about Bolo Young and his career and how he's perceived in Hong Kong and what happened after Bloodsport and all that stuff, which was after this film. They talk a lot about Eric Chang's career. Like I said, he's in this film, and he's extremely successful and has done so much. And like I said, they call him the film industry unto himself. And Arna says some really interesting stuff about Sammo Hung's experimental nature and how he's willing to try all these different things. And if you look at him compared to Jackie and a lot of other filmmakers of that era, he's a lot more experimental. He thinks very differently than them. And they talk about his ability as a director, as a writer, as a star. Arna does some really interesting analysis of like how the directing and the editing kind of is done to juggle all these huge, there's so many characters in this movie and there's so many factions of characters that eventually all come together. How is he juggling that and cross-cutting and like all that stuff, and how it's really well handled, and the filmmaking technique that goes into all these fight scenes and cross-cutting the fight scenes and making sure the whole movie edits together and is not a complete incoherent mess. And that's something that everyone kind of talks about. Frank talks about that, and James Oliver talks about that in his essay, how, you need an absolute mastery of form in order to make a movie like this and not have it fall apart into complete incoherent mush. And a lot of martial arts filmmakers don't get credit for their mastery of form because we think of them as like pulp films, genre films, grindhouse films. And Sammo's just incredible. So I'm going to end it here. It's been a really long video. We're at 25 minutes now. It's the Eureka release of Millionaire Express. This is an absolute must-have for fans of classic Hong Kong cinema, especially the 80s stuff, especially the action martial arts comedy stuff. My name is Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. This is from Eureka. There will be a link in the description of the video to where you can pick this up. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.